August 5th, 2026. 44 ships. That's the number U.S. Central Command put on the record just 2 days ago. 44 commercial vessels redirected. 2 disabled, 2 boarded, all inside one of the narrowest, most contested stretches of water on the planet. Not warships, not military targets. Commercial traffic, oil tankers, cargo carriers, the ordinary plumbing of the global economy, caught in the crossfire of an American blockade that Donald Trump himself just gave a name. "We have total control," Trump told reporters this week. Then he reached for the phrase that's about to define this entire chapter of the war. "We have a thing called a blockade with the Navy. They call it a wall of steel. The United States wall of steel, a wall of steel, not a metaphor. An actual physical 20-plus ship naval cordon sitting across the mouth of the Persian Gulf, backed by carrier strike groups, destroyers, minesweepers, and more than 16,000 American sailors and Marines deployed to strangle one country's access to the sea while simultaneously trying to keep the rest of the world's oil moving through a eulogy narrow channel that Iran has spent 5 months trying to shut down completely." Think about that juxtaposition for a second, because it's the whole story in miniature. The same stretch of waters simultaneously being blockaded and kept open by the same Navy, depending entirely on whose flag is on the ship, trying to pass through it. That is not a contradiction anyone in Washington is particularly eager to explain on camera, but it is exactly the operational reality out on the water tonight. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles across at its narrowest point, the single passage through which roughly a fifth of the entire planet's oil and natural gas used to flow before this war began. This is the story of how it became the most heavily militarized shipping lane on Earth. And this is the story of what's happening in it right now. Tonight, as diplomats in Muscat and Washington argue about whether they're even negotiating with each other at all, let's go back to where this started, because the Strait didn't become a battlefield by accident. On July 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a surprise military campaign against Iran, striking military and government targets, and in one of the most consequential single moments of the entire war, killing Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Iran's response was immediate, and it was aimed exactly where it would hurt the global economy most: the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran effectively closed the waterway, warning that any vessel belonging to the United States, Israel, or their allies would now be treated as a legitimate target. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began boarding and attacking merchant ships. Then came the mines laid across a channel used by roughly 100 ships a day in peacetime, half of them oil tankers carrying a combined 20 million barrels of crude on an average day. Overnight, one of the arteries of the entire global economy went from routine to radioactive. Insurers immediately began pricing in war risk on any vessel that so much as approached the Gulf. Shipping companies started quietly rerouting entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk the strait at all, adding weeks and millions of dollars to voyages that used to take days. Energy traders half a world away, watching all of it unfold on a screen, started doing the only thing energy traders know how to do. When 20% of the planet's oil supply suddenly becomes a war zone, they started buying futures contracts like the sky was falling, because for a few genuinely uncertain days in early March, it looked like it might be. The United States didn't sit back and watch it happen. On March 19th, the Pentagon launched what would become known as the Strait of Hormuz campaign, a sustained aerial and naval operation built around a single objective: physically reopening the waterway by hunting down and destroying the Iranian naval vessels, drones, and mine-laying craft that were choking it off. 12 days into the fighting, the Pentagon announced that American forces had destroyed 16 Iranian boats, believed to be laying naval mines in the strait, after Tehran began seeding the waterway with explosives capable of shutting down one of the most critical oil corridors on the planet. Defense officials at the time warned that the coming days could bring some of the most intense strikes of the entire war, with American aircraft hammering Iranian ballistic missile infrastructure and drone production facilities in parallel with the maritime fight. By April 13th, the United States escalated further, imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, enforced, according to the Pentagon's own language, impartially against vessels of every nation entering or leaving Iranian coastal waters, while insisting it would not impede free passage for ships simply transiting the strait to reach non-Iranian ports. Iran, for its part, laid out its own rules of the road, a so-called Tehran toll booth, a route past Iran's Larak Island that required ships to coordinate directly with the Revolutionary Guard, provide documentation, and in some cases pay a fee just to pass through waters that international law says belong to no one. Two competing systems, two competing claims of sovereignty over the same 21 miles of ocean, and caught directly in between, thousands of ordinary merchant sailors, oil tankers worth hundreds of millions of dollars each, and a global energy market watching every single transit like a heart monitor. That's the world this war built in the Strait of Hormuz. And 5 months later, it still hasn't been resolved. In fact, as you're about to see, the last 72 hours might be the most volatile the Strait has seen since the blockade began. To put the stakes in perspective, this is not some obscure regional waterway. The Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point in the entire global energy trade, the funnel through which tankers from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iran itself have moved crude to the rest of the planet for generations. Shut it down completely, even briefly, and the shockwaves don't stay in the Persian Gulf. They show up in gas prices in Ohio, shipping, insurance premiums in London, and container costs in Shanghai. That's why a blockade tally like 44 ships redirected isn't just a military statistic. It's a number with a direct line to what people pay at the pump on the other side of the planet. Stay with us, because in the next section we go inside the actual machinery of that wall of steel. The carriers, the minesweepers, the failed escort mission that never should have worked, and the incident that finally forced American warships back into the Strait for the first time since the war began. To understand 44 ships redirected in a single tally, you have to understand just how much hardware the United States has actually parked in and around the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a handful of patrol boats. This is one of the largest concentrated naval deployments the U.S. military has assembled in the Middle East in years. A buildup that, at its peak, pulled together a meaningful fraction of the entire deployed U.S. Navy into a single, narrow theater of operations. By mid-April, barely 6 weeks into the war, the Navy already had at least 21 warships in the region, along with more than 16,500 sailors and Marines. Then came the order for reinforcements, a third aircraft carrier strike group, additional minesweepers, and roughly 6 more vessels inbound, a buildup that would ultimately put at least 27 Navy ships in theater, or roughly 41% of the entire U.S. Navy's actively deployed fleet worldwide, concentrated in one region, around one stretch of water. Among the carriers ordered into the fight, the USS George H.W. Bush, joining a rotation that already included multiple strike groups cycling through the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. The mine threat alone forced a complete overhaul of how the Navy operates in these waters. Over the previous year, the fleet had already begun retiring its older Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships in favor of a new generation of littoral combat ships purpose-built for the job. Vessels like the USS Canberra, the first Independence-class LCS, fitted with a dedicated mine countermeasure package, deployed alongside sister ships USS Santa Barbara and USS Tulsa. Those ships, along with underwater drones, became the tip of the spear for the single most dangerous task in the entire campaign, clearing a channel that Iran had deliberately seeded with explosives, one sonar sweep at a time. It's worth pausing on just how tedious and unglamorous that specific job actually is, because it rarely makes the highlight reel next to fighter jets and bunker busters. Mine warfare is slow, methodical, and almost entirely invisible to the public. A crew scanning meter by meter of seabed, sending down an unmanned vehicle, waiting, confirming, and moving on to the next grid square, for days and weeks at a time, in water that an adversary has specifically designed to kill anyone who gets it wrong. There is no headline-friendly footage of a minesweeper doing its job well. There's only the absence of an explosion, which is precisely the point. The politics of actually using all this hardware were messier than the hardware itself. In early May, the Trump administration announced an operation called Project Freedom, a plan to actively guide merchant ships through the Strait using guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, and a range of unmanned systems. It sounded decisive. It lasted 2 days. Trump abruptly shut it down on May 6th, and reporting at the time noted the uncomfortable truth underneath the announcement. The U.S. Navy didn't actually have enough assets in the region to mount genuine escort convoys the way it had during the tanker war of the late 1980s, when even a single 2-ship convoy required 5 American escorts. As of that point in the war, the Navy had roughly a dozen destroyers in the entire Middle East, powerful but nowhere near enough to personally shepherd the volume of commercial traffic that used to move through Hormuz every single day. So Washington shifted its approach from escorting to what officials carefully called accompanying and coordinating. U.S. forces would not physically flank commercial vessels ship for ship. Instead, they'd communicate with ship owners, share safe routing information, and hold assets in position to respond if a threat materialized. Some ship owners began quietly filing their transit plans with the Naval Cooperation and Guidance for Shipping Group in Bahrain, working on the assumption, never formally guaranteed, that the U.S. Navy would intervene if Iranian forces moved against them. As Lloyd's List's own editor-in-chief put it at the time, transit decisions remained solely with ship operators. There was no central coordination, just quiet, informal cover. Then, on April 11th, came a genuine milestone, American warships crossed the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began. 2 guided missile destroyers, the USS Frankie Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy, transited the strait and operated inside the Arabian Gulf. Part of a mission CENTCOM described as ensuring the waterway was fully clear of the sea mines Iran's Revolutionary Guard had laid. It wasn't coordinated with Tehran. Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of CENTCOM, announced that the U.S. had begun the process of establishing an entirely new safe passage, one it intended to share with the global maritime industry to get commerce moving again. Trump, never one to undersell a headline, framed the entire mission as a favor to the world, name-checking China, Japan, South Korea, France, and Germany as beneficiaries of an American Navy clearing mines laid by someone else's war. But mine clearing and blockade enforcement are 2 very different missions running on parallel tracks. One trying to open the strait for the world, the other trying to close it specifically to Iran. And it's that second mission, the blockade itself, that produced this week's number. 44 ships redirected, 2 disabled, 2 boarded. Every one of those interactions represents a moment where an American warship physically intervened in the middle of one of the most economically vital waterways on Earth. And every one of those moments carried the live risk of becoming the spark that reignites the war at full scale. None of this hardware is static either. Ships rotate in and out on deployment cycles, carrier strike groups hand off patrol responsibilities, and minesweepers work in relays because the search for explosives in a channel this narrow, this deep, and this heavily trafficked never actually stops. It just changes crews. That's the unglamorous reality behind a phrase like wall of steel. Less a single dramatic formation, and more a constantly rotating, endlessly maintained industrial operation, one that has to run 24 hours a day for as long as either side refuses to blink. Because even while that blockade has held, the strait itself has kept bleeding. That's where we go next. While the world was debating whether diplomats were talking to each other, someone was still shooting. Because for every headline about ceasefires, memorandums, and final stage negotiations, the water itself keeps delivering a far blunter message. Nobody has actually secured the Strait of Hormuz, no matter what any government's press release claims this week. On the night of August 3rd into August 4th, British maritime authorities confirmed that a cargo vessel was struck by an unknown projectile roughly 23 miles northeast of Al-Qasab, Oman, squarely along the southern shipping route that the United States has spent months backing as the safe alternative to Iran's own controlled corridor. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Center didn't identify the ship, its flag, or its cargo. It didn't need to. The location told the story on its own. This was a strike on the exact lane Washington has been telling the world's ship owners to trust. It wasn't an isolated incident. Just a day earlier, the same monitoring agency had reported an explosion near another vessel in almost the identical stretch of water. Iran's state-run news agency later published photographs, it said, showed the Marshall Islands flagged tanker Velos. Amber, flames visible around its stern. Iran has not explicitly claimed responsibility for either strike. It hasn't needed to deny it very hard either. The message lands regardless of who signs their name to it. The American-backed route is not as safe as Washington claims it is. The timing could not have been more pointed. These strikes landed less than 48 hours after Trump publicly described ongoing negotiations with Iran as Tehran's last chance to reach a deal, and just one day after the Joint Maritime Information Center, the body, responsible for real-time threat assessments in the region, issued a formal warning that hostile action by Iranian forces in the Strait remained highly likely under current conditions. Part of that assessed threat, according to the JMIC's own language, was continued pressure on commercial vessels to abandon the U.S.-backed southern lane and instead funnel through the Iran-controlled northern corridor, the exact route Tehran has spent the war trying to force shipping traffic onto, by intimidation if diplomacy won't do it. This is the strategic knife fight hiding underneath every headline about a ceasefire or a final stage of negotiations, control over which. Lane a tanker takes through 21 miles of water is not a logistics footnote. It is the entire war in miniature. Whoever controls the route controls the tolls, the inspections, the leverage, and, most importantly, the narrative of who actually won the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Consider what each side actually gains from winning that argument. If shipping traffic ends up flowing predominantly through Iran's northern corridor, Tehran gets to collect fees, inspect cargo, and effectively tax a waterway the rest of the world considers international. If traffic flows through the American-backed southern lane along Oman's coast, Washington gets to claim it broke the blockade Iran imposed and restored something closer to pre-war normalcy, without ever having to formally negotiate terms with Tehran at all, to completely different economic and political outcomes, both wearing the same disguise. The strait is open again. Zoom out across the full 5 months of this campaign, and the human and material cost of that fight comes into sharper focus. Since the crisis in the Strait began on February 28th, at least one tugboat has been sunk outright. At least 17 merchant ships have been damaged, 7 of them abandoned by their crews entirely. 2 merchant vessels have been captured outright. 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing. A port worker was killed and 2 more wounded in an attack in Bahrain. And at the height of the disruption, roughly 6,000 seafarers found themselves stranded aboard ships they could not safely move, trapped in a war zone they had no part in starting, simply because their cargo happened to be sitting in the wrong stretch of ocean at the wrong point in history. Even when the fighting has quieted, the traffic numbers tell their own brutal story. Before the war, close to 100 ships a day moved through the Strait. In the roughly 3-week window after the preliminary June ceasefire agreement briefly reopened the waterway, only about 513 ships transited it total, an average of 28 a day, barely a quarter of the pre-war norm. And that was before this week's renewed attacks reignited fears that traffic could freeze up all over again. Analysts tracking the Strait in real time have noted that many vessels are now avoiding the historic shipping channels altogether, rerouting instead through one of 2 improvised corridors, a northern route through Iranian waters and a southern route through Omani waters under American oversight, while the central section of the Strait, believed to be the most heavily mined stretch of the entire waterway, sits almost entirely abandoned by commercial traffic that simply refuses to risk it. That is what control of the Strait of Hormuz actually looks like in practice right now. Not a clean binary of open or closed, but a fractured 3-lane, trust-deprived corridor where every captain has to gamble on which route is less likely to get them killed this week. Into that vacuum stepped Trump's blockade tally. 44 ships redirected, a number meant to project total American command of the waterway. But a number like that only tells you what the U.S. Navy did. It doesn't tell you what's still getting through anyway, in the dark. Without a flag, without a claim of responsibility. It's the kind of statistic that looks decisive on a press release and considerably murkier once you're the crew standing on deck, watching the horizon for a projectile nobody officially fired. And that fractured picture is exactly the backdrop against which today's diplomatic drama is unfolding. Because right now, the United States and Iran can't even agree on whether they're negotiating with each other at all. Here is exactly where things stand this morning, August 5th, 2026. And it is, frankly, a mess of contradictions dressed up as diplomacy. Start with Washington's version of events. President Trump has laid out what he describes as a 2-phase roadmap to end this war. Phase 1, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which Trump said was set to happen on August 4th. Phase 2, expected to take considerably longer, the full denuclearization of Iran's nuclear program. Trump has framed the pause in major American strikes, the operation he himself called potentially the biggest attack since World War II, as an act of restraint made specifically to give this 2-phase process room to work. In a social media post explaining the decision, he said he had agreed to cancel the attack for the future benefit of the world and for what he called the survival of a successful and prosperous Iran, while warning explicitly that he remains prepared to order the strikes if Tehran doesn't move toward a deal. He has not softened his language beyond that warning. Trump has openly called Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous, accusing them of quietly seeking negotiations with the United States, while publicly denying any such talks were happening at all. He's called this moment Iran's last chance to sign what he termed a good document, adding in characteristically blunt terms that he wants to give Tehran every last opportunity before what he described as decapitation. Now here's Tehran's version, and it does not match Washington's at all. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghei stated flatly this week, "We are not currently negotiating with the United States." According to Baghei, Iran's only active talks are with Oman, focused narrowly on one specific issue, establishing a new temporary shipping corridor through the strait that would eventually replace both the northern route Iran currently controls and the American-backed Southern Passage. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, went further over the weekend, posting that those Oman-mediated negotiations were entering their final stages, describing a cabinet report in which he characterized the talks as being finalized. But Baghei was explicit about one non-negotiable point that undercuts the entire premise of Washington's Phase 1 timeline. The Strait of Hormuz, he said, will not return to its pre-war arrangement. Not now, not as part of any deal. Iran intends to walk away from this war with a fundamentally different set of rules governing the waterway than existed before February 28th, regardless of what Trump's own 2-phase plan assumes. That single sentence is the entire conflict compressed into one diplomatic soundbite. Washington's plan for Phase 1 implicitly assumes something close to a return to normal transit through Hormuz. Iran has just told the world on the record that normal is off the table permanently. Two governments using the same word, reopening, to describe two completely incompatible outcomes. And underneath both of those public positions sits the actual legal argument nobody seems able to resolve. Washington maintains that the June Memorandum of Understanding between the two countries legally required Iran to fully reopen the waterway. Tehran insists that same memorandum preserved its authority over the strait, meaning in Iran's reading that a reopened Hormuz can still be a Hormuz that Iran taxes, monitors, and routes on its own terms. Both governments are pointing at the same signed document and describing two different wars, and boarding vessels bound for Iranian ports, the Navy's mine-clearing operations still grinding through a strait littered with explosives nobody has fully mapped, and merchant crews still gambling every single night on which of three unofficial routes gives them the best odds of reaching open water. Just hours before this script was written, another unidentified projectile found another unidentified ship in exactly the stretch of water Washington insists is the safe one. Layer on top of that the sheer number of actors with a stake in the outcome, Gulf allies who begged Trump to hold off on the bigger, strike just days ago, European and Asian economies whose energy security depends on tanker traffic they have zero control over, insurers recalculating war risk premiums by the week, and a domestic American audience watching gas prices for any hint of what's happening 7,000 miles away, and it becomes clear why neither government can afford to simply declare victory and walk away. Too many people are watching for the declaration to hold up under scrutiny if the water tells a different story the very next night. So is this the beginning of the end of the fight over the Strait of Hormuz, or just the next entry in a 5-month pattern of announced breakthroughs that collapse within days? The honest answer, this morning, is that nobody, not the shipping companies rerouting around the most mined stretch of ocean on the planet, not the sailors on the 20-plus American warships still parked in theater, and very possibly not even the two governments issuing dueling statements about whether they're talking to each other, actually knows yet. What we do know is this. 44 ships have already been redirected by an American blockade that shows no sign of stepping back. 27 U.S. Navy vessels remain on station. And somewhere in the dark waters off Al-Qasab tonight, another tanker crew is deciding which lane to risk, northern, southern, or the empty, mined middle that almost nobody dares to cross anymore. We'll be tracking the Oman talks, the blockade numbers, and any confirmed claim of responsibility for this week's strikes as they develop. If Hormuz genuinely reopens on Washington's terms, we'll bring you that. If it doesn't, and the last 5 months say don't be shocked if it doesn't, we'll bring you that too, the moment it happens.